Snow drifted through the branches of the godswood as if shaken loose by some careful hand, each flake spiraling into its place upon the brown leaves and dark earth and the red eyes of the heart tree. John stood beneath those eyes with his gloves off, fingers numb and stinging in waves, as if the tree were breathing through him. Ghost's white shape lay at the edge of the clearing, ears pricked sharply toward the quiet yard, so still that the wolf seemed carved from frost and breath. "We have to do it now," John said to the cold air, to the root knot that rose like a spine from the ground, "before the storm wakes." He had called the lords before, for battle against the Boltons, and they had come with reluctance and old wounds. But the thing that walked toward them under a moon that would not set was larger than grudges. It had neither hunger for bread nor fear of blade, an army that wanted only to spread its absence. That was what the free folk had said, in their coarse songs and dwindling fires. The ravens had taken hours to fly and minutes to return. He could still hear the beating of their wings as they lifted out of the rookery, as if their departure had thinned the air. Behind him, boots crunched on the frost-sharp ground. "You stay out here until your blood turns to slush. You'll be no good to anyone," Davos said, stepping under the ancient branches. The old smuggler wore a scarf up to his nose and had frost webbing his eyebrows, but his eyes were as practical as hearthstone. "The hall's warming. The big lords have started to arrive. Manderley brought a belly like a barrel and a mind like a book. Royce has iron in his voice even when he's praising the stew." John pulled his gloves back on. His breath hung in front of him, peeled away by the wind. "Do they know?" he asked. Davos's mouth pressed into something that could have been a thin smile. "They know enough to want to look like they knew more all along. They'll say they were always for you. They'll say their fathers swore to a Stark before they were born and their sons will do the same. Some of that will even be true." "I'm not asking them to be for me," John said. "We'll never hold if they're for me more than they're for each other." Davos tilted his head. "You're the one who wanted a council, not for a crown." John turned to the heart tree again. In the bark, he saw his father's face for a blink. Not because the lines matched, but because he had learned, as a boy, to look for guidance there when words were scarce. "It has to be her, Sansa. They'll follow me into the storm, but only if they feel like they can set me there when it suits. They won't play those games with a queen who grew up in these halls, with her father's bones below her feet. And you'll kneel." Davos's voice found the question without surprise. "You've worn a crown of words, if nothing else." They shouted it until the rafters shook. "I'll kneel," John said. "I can do more as her sword than as their prize." Davos nodded once. "Then we'd best get on with it." Manderley's already making speeches in his head. The great hall was a beast waking. Fires stoked to a deep roar, haunches and breads turned on spits, benches filling with faces that matched old tales. Banners hung along the walls like a line of cold waves. The roaring merman of Manderley, the black bear of Mormont, the silver fist of Glover, the horsehead of Ryswell, the two-headed green and white of Serwyn, the sunburst of Karstark, the chained giant of Umber. Beside them flew the falcon of the Vale, iron bright on blue silk. Jon Royce had marched through the gates with a line of knights in bright steel and discipline like a drawn sword. Sansa already stood at the dais. Light caught in her hair like frost. There was no crown on her head and no cloak across her shoulders, but her bearing was as sure as stone. She watched each face as it settled, the way one might watch the sky before choosing whether to harvest. Arya leaned in the shadow of a pillar, a slim slash of dark and quiet, her eyes unreadable, as if she were measuring where the words would land. Near her, Bran sat with a blanket across his knees, his gaze turned a touch inward, his breath slow. Sometimes, since his return, he seemed to be walking somewhere no one else could see. Lyanna Mormont had planted herself in a place where she could be seen by all without trying to be. Chin high, eyes daring anyone to be foolish. Wyman Manderley's laughter found pockets among the tables and swelled them warm. Lord Glover's jaw worked as if he were chewing on a decision. The Serwyns sat straight as lances. The mountain clanmen muttered into their beards like a small storm coiled in one corner. Tormund, taller than most and wild as pine, stood near the edge of the dais with a grin that promised either trouble or friendship, and no one could tell which until it arrived. Littlefinger's eyes slid from shadow to light, bottom-lid smile as fragile as an eggshell. He had come dressed in black that would have hidden him better if he'd stayed farther from the fire. Jon felt all of it in a rush, a tide pulling him toward the place he did not want to stand. He stepped up, turned, and held up a hand for silence. The room obeyed him before it thought to do otherwise. For a flicker, he saw how intoxicating this could be. His father had never seemed to require it. The room had always quieted for him because it felt right to. Jon did not feel like what felt right. He felt like what he needed to be. "You were called to winter," he said, his voice carrying under timber beams darkened by old smoke. "Not to flattery, not to songs. We all know what walks. Some of you have seen it. Some of you have lost men to it. We can fight one another and die sure of our pride, or we can fight something that doesn't care about the names we carry." He looked past them to Sansa. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of breath and chair wood and the crack of fire were far away. "I called you here so you could see the person who must sit over this," he said, and his throat felt raw. There was a wavering, a shifting, as if the hall itself had felt the ground change. Manderley's lips parted around a speech he hadn't expected to give tonight. Yohn Royce's attention sharpened like ice. Littlefinger's fingers steepled over nothing. Jon knelt. A sound like a gasp and a knife unsheathed ran through the room. He put Longclaw across his palms, the Valyrian steel dark as wet stone, and lifted it to his sister. "My father's house," he said, speaking to the sword so he would not have to see anyone's face but hers, "was made to keep winter. It's in the bones. I don't have his name, but I have his blood, and I swore my life once already to the wall. I will give it to the North again, but I won't wear its crown. We need someone who can bind us like iron and hold the chain's shape when the cold pulls. This is Sansa Stark, daughter of Eddard, Lady of Winterfell by every truth that matters. Let her be your queen, and I'll be the sword in her hand." Sansa came down the steps. She did not look surprised. She looked, above all, certain, like someone who had been walking toward this moment for years without knowing it. She took the sword in both hands, its weight heavy and sure. "You know me," she said, and the hall quieted in a different way. Not the hush commanded by a battlefield voice, but the stillness that comes when people lean in. "You know what happened to my father. You know what happened to my brothers. You know who sat in this hall and called himself Lord while our people bled for sport. You know who lay dying on the snow while I watched a gate open. You know who opened it." She did not look at anyone when she said it, but the hall knew. "The North remembers. I will never forget. I will be what this hall needs me to be, and I will ask hard things, and I will give more than I ask." She lifted Longclaw until it stood like a small column of night between them. "Rise, Jon," she said softly enough that only those closest could have heard the words, but something settled over the room as if everyone had. He stood, and she turned to the lords, her hair like a banner of winter wheat in the firelight. "If you will have me," she said, "take the bread and salt of Winterfell tonight and give me your words. If you are here to bargain and hedge, if your honor is a blanket you pull to yourself and leave your neighbors to freeze, eat elsewhere." Manderley bellowed with delight and slammed a huge hand on the table. "A queen who has my mother's steel," he declared to no one in particular. "I'll swear for White Harbor until our bellies are empty and our bones are bent." Lyanna Mormont stood on her bench. "Our men are mostly dead and the rest are children and grandfathers," she announced crisply. "But we've more spines than that." She slapped her small palm on the table. "We'll swear." Yohn Royce inclined his head, knight to sovereign. "The veil rides for honor," he said. "We know what it is when we see it." Glover stood slowly, shame written in the set of his shoulders. "We failed you once," he said. "We will not again." He lifted his cup, eyes on Sansa. Other voices rose. The room turned to a sound that was not chanting, not quite, but had the same weight as a song that people had needed to sing for a long time and had finally found their moment to begin. Jon felt Ghost press against his leg. the wolf's warmth grounding, the world narrowing to Sansa's face, and then expanding again as if the hall had opened a new seam to the world. Only one voice did not lift. Littlefinger's smile remained, but his eyes had gone thin and watchful, like a man calculating the weight of a bridge he did not trust. That night, Sansa was crowned with iron and bronze, the circlet that had rested on a hook in the crypt for so long it had learned to be quiet. She wore it like it had been waiting for her. Jon watched the moment and did not feel loss. He felt, for the first time since he'd stood upon the wall and looked out at endless white, like something was moving the right way. They set to work before dawn, because dawn itself seemed less trustworthy than it had once been. Sansa moved through Winterfell like someone mapping a river in flood. She took stock of the granaries and found them wanting, then sent ravens and riders both to White Harbor with a writ sealed in dark wax. In the city of Mermen, Wyman Manderly's cooks had already been doubling loaves and training young hands to stretch the flour, but now his scribes began tallying fishermen with the same intensity given to knights. Salted cod, pickled eels, barrels of smoked herring. These began their long journey along the White Knife and the King's Road, under banners that warned thieves that they were stealing from the north itself. In the forges, the smiths shrugged off sleep and rust. Micken was gone, but his apprentice, Tom Barley, thick-shouldered and shy, struck hot iron until his hair curled in the heat. Jon came to him with a wrapped bundle of black glass, arrowheads and old spear points pulled from crumbling leather pouches found buried near the fist of the first men, and Tom touched one with a surprised reverence. "Obsidian," he said, remembering a story told at a hearth. "Dragon glass." "Not much," Jon said. "Enough to teach with." They learned quickly. Dragonglass cracked like pride if cut wrong and sang with a thin sound if struck right. The smiths learned to set the heads on shafts with glue boiled from old hides and resin and to wrap them in tight sinew. They carved knives for women who had never thought to hold one and made spikes to be nailed into the doors of granaries and the shutters of barns. "If they come," Jon told a room of small folk who looked at him with a mix of fear and stubbornness, "you stab for the light in their eyes, or you break the hand that's reaching for you. If you break it right, it won't rise again." "SM. Ash the head," Tormund said cheerfully from the back of the room, holding up a club the size of a small tree and letting the laughter loosen hands and throats. "It works on most things." Ravens came and went in a black flicker. From the citadel, a letter from Samwell Tarly arrived, fat with ink and 3 pages of hastily cramped script that slanted as if the words were running toward them. Dragonglass was written in that letter a dozen times. Where it had been mined, what the old books whispered of its making, the melted river that had made Dragonstone's hill. There were drawings too, one that showed a net of obsidian beads strung on rawhide and thrown over an approaching figure until it stuck. Another that depicted a harpoon tipped in black glass long as a man's forearm. "Sam," Jon said, and his voice bent around the name the way it always had. He wrote back with thanks and with urgency, and Sam's reply returned by a boy whose cap didn't fit and whose boots were patched a dozen ways, as if the letter had knitted its own path north through anyone who would carry it. Bran's voice reached them not through ravens but through him. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, Jon would find him in the Godswood, eyes turned to something beyond the branches as if he were listening to an old song and trying to remember the next verse. When he spoke, his words were simple and terrible. "The wall is not a wall everywhere," he said once, with his palms pressed flat on the root-knotted earth. "It is thinner where the sea gnaws and where the ice was patched over and where men were tired and the old spells stumbled. They'll find a place that has forgotten what it's meant to do." "The wall won't forget," Jon said, but even as he said it he remembered the way frost would creep along a window when you were careless with the latch. Bran turned his head. "He is learning to be a storm," he said, and though he did not say a name, everyone listening knew who he meant. The shape that moved at the heart of the cold, the one who looked at men and saw only candles to be snuffed, the one whose crown was not hammered metal but a ring of jagged ice. The council became a constant thing, not just in the hall, where lords banged cups and stomped boots, but in the yards where Sansa spoke to women with flour on their hands and men with frost in their beards. In the kennels, where she touched the old hounds and told the boy who slept there that if he saw anyone he did not know near the food stores, He was to tell her or Arya directly before he told anyone else. In the stairwells, where she spoke quietly to Jon Royce about the Vale stores and the salt on their roads, about the knights training in snow and the way their lances could be tipped with glass. Littlefinger watched and waited. He was good at learning what people forgot to guard. But he had misjudged the way the Stark children had learned to watch. He had taught Sansa some of that himself, thinking he was carving her into something he could place on a shelf. He hadn't accounted for Bran's eyes or Arya's silence or the way Jon moved like someone who had already given his life once and had no time left for pretty lies. They brought him before the hearth with the benches empty, only the household guard and the people whose names had shrunk to the bones of their purpose. Sansa, Jon, Arya, Bran, Davos, Royce. Winterfell had been built for such hours. The stone didn't want to hear gossip. It had carried secrets for too long. "You sold my aunt," Sansa said. Her voice did not tremble, though if someone had touched the air they would have felt it vibrate. "You sold her and called it love." Littlefinger's hands spread, his palms soft. "We were children." Bran's voice cut like a knife drawn across frost. "You pushed my mother's sister through a moon door," he said, and the dryness of it was worse than any shouted accusation. "You loved her while you were planning her fall. You loved my mother while you were putting knives in the pockets of men who would draw them. You loved my sister when you delivered her to someone who wrapped his cruelty around his hands like gloves." His eyes were on nothing and everything at once. "I can hear the sound the sky made when she fell. It didn't want to, but it opened." Littlefinger's breath hitched. He looked for an exit the way a rat looks for a seam in a barrel. He found none. "Bran," he said, as if using the boy's name might unmake his knowing. "You don't, these are stories. They tell you." "I don't need stories," Bran said, and for a heartbeat the hall felt colder. Royce stepped forward, his face a mountain cliff. "In the Vale, you have as many enemies as you have friends," he said. "And that was before a boy with the past in his eyes took it upon himself to call your accounts." He looked at Sansa. "Say the word." "Send him to the Eyrie?" Davos said. "He'll cut his own leash before we've turned our backs." Sansa had held anger like a hot coin all her life, flipping it, letting it burn her fingers and then pocketing it. Now she looked at the man who had taught her to cut like a whisper. "You did so much with so little," she said quietly. "It's almost admirable. Almost." She did not say the words herself. She looked to Arya, and Arya moved like wind on a winter night, present and not inevitable. Littlefinger went down with a sound that seemed to surprise him, a flat exhale. Blood met the stone and ran there, and the stone took it without comment. Outside, a wind rose and died again, as if the old castle were correcting its breath. The Vale swore harder for it. Jon Royce put a mailed hand over his heart and said in his straightforward way that the falcon had flown too long in circles, catching its tail in the wind. "No more," he said. "We'll fly straight for once." With the poisoning of that well washed clean, people began to drink more freely from it. The mountain clans sent men and women with shields made from old sledges. Raven came from the neck, and 2 days later a boat slid along the White Knife as if remembering a path it had known before. In the boat stood 2 crannogmen with reeds in their hair and mud on their boots in patterns that meant things to those who knew how to read them. They bowed to Sansa with an ease that made her chest tighten. "Howland Reed is coming," the older one said without preamble. "He has a message from the trees." When Howland arrived, he stepped into the Godswood as into a room he had built himself. He bowed to the heart tree and then to Sansa, and when he lifted his gaze to Bran, his mouth softened as if he had reached a shore he had long sought. He spoke that night in the Hall of the Barrows and the old kings who slept in them, and of salt and iron laid across doorways, and of bindings that were not chains but promises. "You can't bar the cold," he said, "but you can make it step carefully." He showed them how to hang iron in loops over barn doors with bits of red string, how to lay salt in a clean circle and then sweep it with a goose wing while speaking the names of the dead whose bones lay in the house. "Tell them you remember them," he said, "not because they need to be told, but because you need to hear yourself say it." He taught the smiths to inlay iron at the threshold as thin as thread and the women to sew slivers of it into the hems of children's coats. He and Bran spent long hours with their heads bent together, the boy's eyes dark and the man's voice quiet, and when they emerged they had maps in their hands. Maps of the weirwoods, their roots like an underground river, places where they could be approached, places where they refused. "The old gods do not promise victory," Howland said, looking around the room. "They promise witness. But sometimes that's the same as a kind of courage." The first real news of winter walking south came with men's breath steaming so thick they looked like they were bleeding fog. They had been watchmen at the last hearth, and they had tried to be mountain and wall both. They had failed, and their failure had been brave. "They came in the night," the oldest said, his beard iced into points. "Not like wolves. Wolves look like life. This was as if the dark itself decided to walk." "Did the arrows take them?" Jon asked, not because he didn't know but because the men needed to say it. "Aye," the man said. "The ones that struck where they look. Not the rest." "Then it works," Davos said. And no one said that it was also not nearly enough. They had already begun the line of fires, but now they set them at closer intervals along the King's Road and the smaller path that ran east of it, up from the White Knife and across the North's broad back. The free folk were best at it. In hours, they could turn a field into a spider's web of ditches and dry kindling and pots of pitch that would break on hard ground like eggs. The northern farmers, who had grown up burning brambles and hedge cuttings, learned fast. The fires weren't meant to defeat anything. They were meant to force it to step where they wanted. The Night's Watch, under Dolorous Ed, was fewer than ever, but the men he had moved like men who had laughed together in dark corridors until laughter was the only thing that kept the dark from changing shape. "We'll give you what's left of the caches," Ed said to Jon when they met on a road that used to feel like a thread tied tight between them. "And we'll give you what's left of our bones when it comes to it." "You'll give me your bones only if you're dead," Jon said. "I'd prefer the other thing." Ed's thin mouth twitched. "I always knew you were difficult." They held the first real line at Queen's Crown, the old ruin with its green tower sunk into a tarn. It was a place that liked remembering. The Crannogmen said the reeds had been whispering at night as if other reeds answered them. Jon brought men who had not forgotten how to be quiet and cold. Wildlings with faces tattooed against old terrors, northern archers who had learned from fathers who had learned from grandfathers, hunters who could draw a bow in thick gloves. They strung obsidian-tipped arrows until their fingers bled and then stuck their fingers in their mouths and kept on working. When the first of the dead stepped from the trees, the air seemed to pull itself away from their bodies as if they had made a wrong turn in the wind. Behind them, in a long file that did not ripple, came the rest. Jon could hear, very faintly, a sound like someone dragging a nail across ice. He lifted his hand, and the archers, who had been breathing together without thinking of it, drew. When he dropped his hand, the sky went black with arrows. They arced and fell and pushed through old flesh and found eye sockets like dark holes punched in the world. Jon watched 3 of the dead fall in close succession and did not let himself feel anything like triumph. Behind him, Davos murmured, "Again." And the archers moved as if someone had taught them a dance with pain for music. The glass broke bones and broke eyes and sometimes broke only itself. The dead came on. They stepped into the first ditch and went down like men into water and did not shout. And then the pots fell from the tower that had once been green and fire licked across pitch and dry reeds, and the night opened in red seams. Jon breathed smoke and stepped back in 3 measured paces as they had practiced. As the fire took for a few seconds and the dead burned not like men but like something old and dry catching at last. They did not stop all of them. They stopped enough to force the rest to choose another path. They held that ruin for a day and a night that felt like a year tattooed on their skin. When the fire had eaten itself and the ditch had filled with bodies that were no longer bodies, the others moved on, as if they had been planning that path all along. They did not turn to throw anyone a backward look. They did know. T need to. That night, Jon wrote to Sansa with hands that had handled more blood than ink. He told her they could slow them. He told her they could shape this fight like a river changed by stones. He did not write anything about hope. He did not have time to write about hope, and in any event, the North had its own ancient language for that. Sansa read his letter in the privacy of the solar her mother had used. She put her hand flat on the words so that she could feel them as well as see them. The room smelled faintly of lavender and parchment and cold iron from the brazier. Outside, the court bustled with the sound of winter, a quieter bustle than summer, but more stubborn. She called for Alice Karstark, tall and pale and newly firm in herself. When the girl came, Sansa put the letter in her hand, and Alice read with a face that gave nothing away. "He needs us to hold them in the fields," Sansa said. "He needs bread for the men and arrows for the archers and people to carry the wounded. He needs a place where the living will not run if they hear something in the night." Alice nodded. "He needs the North," she said. "He needs me," Sansa said simply. "Which means he needs you." Alice's mouth turned up. "I swore," she said. "I meant it. They assigned women to watch the children in the kitchens, not because women could not fight, but because they would be the last ones standing when the rest had to fall back. She found a boy sleeping near the granaries and taught him a trick for the lock and rewarded him with bread the size of his hand. She found a woman with a fear like a bird fluttering in her chest and taught her to grip a knife like a tool rather than a prayer. She found a man whose eyes slid away when asked for his oath and followed him into a shadow where he thought he was alone. "Who pays you?" she asked, her voice as thin as cold. He swallowed. "No one," he said too quickly, and Arya's knife told him he had been foolish. "You don't get to betray us for free," she said. The man looked at her and saw not a little girl but a knight that wanted something from him that he would not surrender without breaking. He told her what she needed to know, and she carried the knowledge to Sansa, who greeted it with the calm of someone who had learned that people were often exactly as poor as their choices. The traitor had friends. The friends were useful until they weren't. Winterfell took back its secrets and let them breathe in the open air where they were less potent. Jon and Ed and Howland and Davos met under a sky that seemed to have been scrubbed too hard. The cold burned clean. It almost smelled like iron in the nose. "They don't rush," Ed said. "They don't need to. The living die without being asked." "We'll make them rush," Jon said. "We'll give them things that look like easy paths and choke them there." He pointed to a place on the map where the last river bent like an elbow. "Here, the ice will be thick enough to bear men, thin enough to collapse if it's asked politely." "How do you ask politely?" Tormund wanted to know. "Do you sing to it, Crow?" "You cut it," Jon said, and he and Howland discussed the angles for an hour while Davos watched the weather like a captain who did not trust the sea though he had used it to feed his children. They set beacons on hilltops, casks of oil and tinder nests, so that when one lit the next would see, and then the next, a snake of fire across the land. Boys were trained to climb and run. Girls were trained to shout orders as if they'd been born with them. Old men were given jobs they could do sitting down, like sharpening knives and telling the young ones when to go to sleep. Every job mattered. Sansa made sure they knew it. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley turned his counting toward making ready boats with shallow drafts, so they could slide along the frozen edges of the White Knife and the long lake carrying sacks of oats and kegs of brine. He sent letters to the Iron Bank that were both very polite and very blunt, and when a dignified man with a talent for numbers and an accent to match arrived at his gate, he fed him soup and told him stories of northern winters that made the man blink. "Lend to us," he said. "We'll pay you in spring with interest, or you'll lose a profit and a chance to be remembered kindly when remembrance will be a rare thing." The man with the numbers lent. He also sent a letter to his superiors describing a fat lord with a voice like a drum who had a way of turning a promise into an investment. Wyman had grown old and heavy. He had not grown smaller. From the sea came, in time, a line of longships with black sails that waited like a flock of dark birds at the mouth of the White Knife until banners waved them in. Yara Greyjoy stood on the prow of the lead ship, the wind cutting her face into angles, her braids stiff with salt. She did not like the North. She liked the way it did not try to like her. "We heard your call," she said to Sansa with bluntness that could have scratched a good blade. "We brought pitch and tar and men who can throw it. We brought mouths too. You'll have to fill them if you want us to fight all night." "I'll fill them," Sansa said. "You'll fight." Yara's mouth bared a quick grin. "I like you," she said. "If you were born on the sea, you'd have slapped my uncle long before I did." "Then it's good I was born here," Sansa said, and Yara laughed. When the wall fell, no one heard the sound at Winterfell. The wall had never come to the castle with sound. It had been a presence the way distance is a presence. A thing that gives shape by being elsewhere. But in Eastwatch, men who had been born to think themselves stalwart saw a piece of their sky tear and fall. And the sea rose up at once, as if it had been waiting centuries for this invitation. Ed watched it happen with the stillness of a man who has run out of words to comfort men with. "Well," he said to no one in particular as ice thundered into water and hissed there like something giving up a ghost. "That's that." He sent ravens that arrived with their wing feathers rimed. Bran knew before the parchment was unrolled. Sansa knew it before she read it, because Bran turned his head west in the courtyard and his eyes went so far past her that she felt like she had become transparent. Jon knew it before a raven left the sea's edge because the air around him changed in a very small way. The way a hound's ears will shift before a sound reaches men. "It's open," Ed's letter said. "He's coming on the tide." The line of fires burned bright enough to be seen from the hills. They could feel it before they saw the first ranks approach. Cold that did not sting but numbed, quiet that did not reassure. The dead came, and the living met them in places chosen with care and defended with bitterness. Sometimes the dead went down like men. Sometimes they did not. At the last river crossing, Howland Reed's people had cut channels under the ice with patient knives. Jon had men lie flat as stones along the bank, their breath-dampening scarves that froze and thawed and froze again. When the dead began to cross, the ice sank and creaked like an old woman's knee. Howland raised his hand and dropped it. People who had been sitting quietly along the bank pulled ropes that had been hidden along the shore, and the sawed ice gave, the river opened its mouth, and a section of the dead went down without changing their faces. They did not kick. They did not claw. They simply disappeared. The ones behind them stepped into the gap as if into a door and sank too, until enough fell that their bodies made a bridge for the rest. That was how it always was. You won a thing by losing something else. They lit the beacons. One hissed into life on a hill north of Winterfell, and then another farther east, and then another beyond that. The snake of fire slithered into the night until men who had never seen each other before found themselves shouting the same thing at once. In the castle, Sansa went to the highest tower and watched the beacons rise like a kind of writing she had learned to read. She marked the pace of them and the places where they grew thick and the places where they flickered. She sent runners and ravens both. She moved food and men and women with such speed that even Davos blinked. "She was born to it," he said to Jon later, the pride in his voice as neat as the way he rolled a knot. "You picked the right crown." Jon did not answer because he did not have to. He was in a field that had been furrows and snow and then blood and glass and now was all of those things. Longclaw moved in his hand like an extension of his thought. He had never liked killing. That had never mattered. He stepped and struck and stepped again, and sometimes when he drove the sword into the cold he felt resistance like old wood and sometimes like stone and sometimes like nothing at all, like cutting shadow. Arya was there and not there, a glimpse of leather and a flash of steel and then nothing. Sometimes Jon saw her across the chaos and the way she moved hurt him in a soft place, because she was his little sister with mud on her face and a braid like a rope, and then she was a small, perfect machine with a purpose that had no room left for childhood. She saved his life twice that he noticed and probably more that he did not. Tormund went through the dead like a man who had sworn an oath he had not told anyone about. Lyanna Mormont climbed onto a cart and sent arrows like stings into eyes, and then leaped down to thrust a spear into something that had once been a tall man and was not a man now. When she stumbled, a woman with gray hair and a boy's face took her elbow and pulled her upright without a word. Jon Royce held the Vales line where the snow drifted deepest and the wind tried to peel men off their feet. His voice cut through the gale with names and commands. A knight fell and was replaced. A standard dipped and rose again. When a thing that was more ice than flesh came for him with a sword that looked like frozen moonlight, he met it with a mace in both hands and a battle cry that had been sung in mountain halls. The mace rang off that sword with a note like water striking a bell, and for a breath Royce faltered, struck by the wrongness of it, the way it sounded beautiful and terrible at once. Then his body remembered that he was a man whose first duty was to stand, and he stood. They lost. Of course they lost. Not all of it. Not everything. They lost in pieces because that's how the living are carved by night. They gave ground. They bled. They fell back to the places Sansa had marked with a finger on a map at a table when the room had been warm and the bread fresh. They lit the oils soaked into straw and watched the flames run like foxes through fields men had sowed in hope. They heard screaming and they heard silence, and sometimes the silence was worse. In Winterfell, Sansa moved from room to room with her circlet braided into her hair so it would not slip. She sat with wounded men and took messages too heavy for some to carry. She stood in the yard and spoke to a crowd of people who were very good at fear. "Do what you have learned to do," she said. "Do it until you cannot any longer, and then hold the person next to you and tell them why they must." Bran asked to be brought to the Godswood when the second night rose without the first having ended. They carried him in his chair, Hodder gone and some other boys taking his weight awkwardly and determinedly. Arya walked beside him as if she could cut anything that tried to touch him. Ghost slunk along the trees with a mouth full of breath. Sansa came too, because she had stopped not going to the places that frightened her a long time ago. Bran placed his hands on the roots at the heart tree and did not speak for a long time. His eyes went past them in a way that made Sansa want to hold him and also to shake him until he came back. When he spoke, his voice was different, older and somehow tenderer. "He's looking for the end of us the way a man looks for the end of a thread," he said. "He thinks if he finds the right one and pulls long enough, the cloth will come apart." Sansa's hands were cold in her gloves. "Is he wrong?" "Yes," Bran said simply. "We were not woven that way. How do we make him step where we want him?" Jon asked. He did not say the name. None of them did, as if names had weight that could tilt a fight. "We make the thread look bright," Bran said. He turned his head slowly to look up at the face carved in the heart tree. "We make him want to pull." "He'll come here," Arya said quietly. Bran did not answer. He did not need to. They made the Godswood into a place where old and new things met. Howland set iron in the thresholds of the small gate and hung strings of it across the path between the walls and the tree. Women swept salt into a circle that Sansa walked and then walked again, speaking with Bran's voice the names of men and women whose bones lay beneath Winterfell until the circle felt like a promise. Tom Barley came with nets made of rawhide threaded with obsidian beads, learned from Sam's drawings, and he showed boys how to throw them, so they spread the way they should. "Throw like you're putting a blanket over a child," he said. The boys nodded, though none of them had children. Jon moved men quietly through the castle to places where they would not be in one another's way when panic rose. He walked the walls and the towers until his legs ached and then told them to ache later. He kissed Ghost's head and tasted fur and cold. He wanted Daenerys then, perhaps. He had not thought he would think it plainly, but he could easily imagine the sound dragons make when they come through cloud and how fire looks when it falls from the sky. He did not know where she had gone. South, likely, to make the South remember that the North was not the only place winter could step. He did not have the luxury of thinking beyond the walls he could see. When it came, it did not come with trumpets or the roar of a siege. It came with the air deciding to become thinner, like a man unfastening his belt a notch to fit a flat stomach. The snow around the gods would seem to hush itself. The flakes that had been drifting simply stopped. "Positions," Jon said quietly, though people already were where they had promised to be. Sansa stood within the salt circle with Bran, her hand on his chair. She was not someone who fought with a blade. She had learned other weapons. Her voice was one, and her stillness when others were afraid was another. She did not sing. She did not pray aloud. She filled the air with a steadiness that could be leaned against, and people leaned. Arya was not where anyone could see her. Howland Reed had a knife across his knees and mud drying on his hands in the shape of a story. Yohn Royce stood at the gate with a small company of knights whose eyes looked like men who had already decided that they would die well if not long. Davos had a net in his hands and a curse under his breath and a memory of a boy named Mathos pressed like a coin under his tongue. The way men carried small griefs to pay with when the time came. Jon had Longclaw. Ghost had his white teeth. They moved like cold becoming visible. They did not crunch the snow underfoot. Jon smelled nothing. He saw frost gather on the branches where there had been none a moment before and knew they were near because the trees shivered. The white shapes stepped out from among the trunks. Behind them came the dead, those who had been men and women just long enough to remember that they had been men and women. He came last, if it was he. He was taller than those who flanked him, his head crowned with ragged ice, his eyes like the inside of a winter night when the stars are too high to be trusted. He did not look around him. He looked only at Bran, as if the rest of them were brush he'd pushed through in a field. The first line of archers loosed. The obsidian fell like a hard rain. The white ones stepped aside in movements that seemed to flow rather than break. A few arrows took where they should and turned bodies to snow and shattered ice. The rest fell. The one with the crown took 2 steps into the iron-salted circle and stopped. He tilted his head. Jon could have sworn he could hear the old magic humming like a small insect, not strong enough to bar anything, strong enough to make this not a thing he could ignore. Jon Royce lifted his mace and stepped toward him as if he were going to ring a bell. The Cold One lifted his sword, and the 2 metals touched and made that ringing sound again that made men's teeth hurt. Royce staggered. The Cold One moved his sword with a neatness that would have been admirable in a man who had learned in a yard. The second blow would have taken Royce at the neck if Davos hadn't thrown the net at that exact moment. The beads of black glass fanning like a wave. It struck the sword and the chest and the face of the thing with a sound like hail on a roof. Where the beads hit, frost hissed and smoked, and the thing recoiled. Not like a man, not with pain, but with an offended surprise. Royce's third blow landed on the sword arm and broke it not with a crunch, but with a clean line like glass shearing. The ring of white figures stepped forward, all at once. Jon did not think. He moved, and Longclaw moved, and Cold moved to meet it. It became a narrow fight then. Not chaos, not clash, but the sort of fight where the world shrinks to a breath and a blade and the space in front of your face. Jon drove Longclaw into one of them and felt it resist and then give. The body broke apart like frost kicked from a branch. He took a step and found another one rising to take the place and took a step again and found a sword like frozen starlight sliding past his cheek by the width of a word unsaid. Bran's breath sounded behind him. Steady, steady. Sansa's voice came quiet and without a tremor, naming the dead beneath their feet, not asking them for anything, just telling them that she remembered. Howland Reed began to hum a small tune that might have been a lullaby. Arya was nowhere, which meant exactly where she should be. The crowned one took another step into the circle and found his foot hesitating again, as if the earth itself needed to think about it. Jon saw the moment for what it was and went toward it like a man goes toward the only door in a room filling with smoke. He lifted Longclaw in both hands and brought it down with everything that was left of him. The sword met the Cold One's blade. He felt it not in his hands but deep in his teeth, in the bones near his ears, as if the sound had gotten inside him and was rearranging him. The Cold One looked at him with a curiosity that was almost bored. He tilted his head again, as if contemplating an insect that would not quite die. His free hand lifted, slow and terrible, and Jon felt his body want to stop moving. Arya struck then. She did not leap. She stepped. It was like watching the last movement of a long practice. Her knife was no thing of legend, just a sliver of dragonglass fastened to a hilt wrapped in leather, sharp and mean. She came from an angle that was only available if you had measured the space 100 times and learned the way a tall man shifts his weight when his attention is fixed on someone taller than you. She drove the knife for the place where the breastbone's plate thins and the glass shivers and then passes. The Cold One turned with a speed that would have been impossible in anything with wind in its lungs. He caught her wrist. For a moment her feet were off the ground, her body a line in air, the knife hand caught in a white fist, her other hand clawing for balance. It would have ended there if not for the net. Tom Barley's father had taught him to throw nets as a boy to catch river fish. He had never planned to throw one at a nightmare, but he had learned the motion so deep he could do it in his sleep, and now he did it awake. The net spread in the air and dropped over the crowned one's arm and face and chest. Where the beads touched him, they hissed. He did not scream. He stilled. That was enough. Arya tore her hand free, and in the same breath Jon came down with Longclaw again. The blade met cold and pushed through it and into something that was less than bone and more than ice. There was a sound then, finally, that did not seem to belong to the world. The small, sharp noise a thing makes when it realizes that the rules have been explained to it inadequately. Light moved under the cold one's skin like lightning under cloud and then snuffed, and his body split along the line of Jon's stroke and fell into shards that steamed and melted without melting. Everything paused, not just men but the dead, not just breath but the absence of breath. The ring of white figures trembled as if a string had been plucked through them, and then, all at once, they shattered. The dead around the godswood fell like sacks on a market day and lay there as if they were truly dead. At last, the way a small mercy might grant. There were still dead abroad in the fields. There were still places where the cold walked like arrogance. But the thing at the center had been cut through, and that mattered to more than the godswood. Men felt something change inside them and began to move like men in sunlight instead of men in a cave. Jon stood with Longclaw in his hand and felt, oddly, not triumph but something like grief. He looked down at the pieces of what he had killed and thought of the old songs that said winter itself had a face, and he had put a blade through it. He had not wanted to be that man. No one ever does in the honest part of themselves. He turned to Sansa and saw that she was crying. Just tears, not sobs, the way winter sometimes breaks into water without telling the air it's going to. Bran's chest rose and fell. His eyes closed slowly, and when he opened them again they were just a boy's eyes, or close enough to comfort. Jon Royce sank to one knee in the snow and laughed once like a bark. Davos let the net slip from his hands and leaned on both knees and breathed as if he had been underwater. Howland Reed wiped mud from his fingers and looked at the heart tree as if it had winked at him. Ghost licked Jon's hand, and his tongue was warm. It did not end in an hour. It did not end in a day. The dead did not become less dead just because the thing that had compelled them had been unraveled, but they were now only what they had been made, and not the extension of a will that wanted the world to grow smaller. Men in the fields watched corpses slow and stop. A boy near Queenscrown, who had thought himself brave enough to be a watchman and had found, to his surprise, that he had been right, prodded a body with his boot and then began to cry in a way that made his shoulders shake and then stop. He did not know the name of the person he cried for. He cried for all of them and also for himself. After, there were funerals that lasted for weeks. They did not lie the bodies down in the crypts. The old gods had been honored enough today. They burned them instead in great, careful pyres that Howland Reed supervised with a care that made his eyes look like a man measuring precious cloth. He put iron in the fire and salt, and he made the people say names. Name them, he said, and they did. Not because it made any difference to the smoke, but because it made a difference to those who stood watching it rise. Sansa walked among the fires and spoke to widows and to boys who had lost their fathers and to men who had lost the shape of their days. She took off her circlet when it seemed too heavy and put it on again when someone looked at it and steadied. She released the chains on the crypt doors with her own hands and felt no stirring of anything that should not stir. She took Arya's hand at dusk one day and held it until the girl, who had become so quiet, leaned into her shoulder for the length of a slow breath. Yara Greyjoy gave a nod that might have been affection if it had not been so sharp and left with her ships, promising to return if called and to say something cruel if not, both with the same loyalty. Jon Royce stayed long enough to put the Vale's dead into earth with northern hands and then rode south with a company that looked smaller because he looked tired. Samwell Tarly arrived, carrying books because books had always been his way to shape the world. He embraced Jon in the yard and cried a little and then laughed and then looked around as if he had arrived in a story and hadn't expected to be given a part. I never thought I'd see the day you killed a... He paused, thinking about what word to use. That? He finished and clapped Jon's shoulder. Jon smiled because Sam always did that to him. You helped, he said, and they both looked for a moment at the net with its glass beads, still hanging on a peg. now holy as a child's toy can be when it's been used to stop a terrible thing. Sansa and Jon went together to the heart tree without words. The snow had softened a little. There was the smell of water in it. The face in the bark looked no different. It had never looked any different. But there was a sense around the clearing, as if something had exhaled a long breath it had been holding since the first men cut the first face into a tree. That was fanciful. Sansa allowed herself the fancy. She was queen. On occasion, she could decide what was true by willing it so in her heart. Father would have said we used what we had, she said. He would have liked that best. I used you, Jon said, not looking at her, as if the admission were a small sin. You trusted me, Sansa corrected. You didn't set me in front of them to stop their mouths. You set me above them because you saw what needed doing and knew you were not the person to do that part. She smiled then, small but real. You've gotten better at letting me teach you. And you at letting me argue with you, Jon said. They were quiet then. The Godswood had always been a place for quiet. It did not have patience for speeches. What will you do? Sansa asked without turning her head. Now? Jon asked, though he had already turned the question over in his mind 100 times and found that it made a shape that kept returning. There are still rangers needed. There's still a wall of sorts. There are still people up there who didn't come down. Tormund needs someone who speaks both languages to keep the peace when old insults turn up at the wrong time. You'll go back, Sansa said. There was no accusation in it. She knew him too well for that. There was only grief and pride shaking hands. He nodded. For a while, he said, until what I am is used up. And then, Sansa asked. Then I'll come home if I have a home, Jon said. And Sansa reached out and took his hand because that was a promise she could answer. She squeezed. He squeezed back. Ghost pressed his head into Jon's fingers with a sigh like a bellows. He left 3 mornings later with a company of free folk who walked like men who had learned to trust their boots more than anything else. Tormund thumped his back hard enough to make him cough and then grinned. You'll make a terrible old man, the big man said fondly. We'll have to find you a chair with spikes so you don't fall asleep in it and forget to be angry. I'm not angry, Jon said, and Tormund laughed until he wheezed. Liar, he said affectionately. You're angrier than any of us. You keep it all in your chest so you don't spill it. That's no way to drink. Jon did not argue. He had learned that some fights were for campfires and some were for fields and some were not for anything except thinking about quietly until they lost their teeth. He mounted and Ghost ran ahead, and the group moved out across the snow with the sort of speed winter gives those who know it. Sansa watched from the wall until they were a line of ants, until she could not tell which one was Jon except by the wolf. She did not cry. She would cry later, when no one would read it as a sign of anything but love. Winter did not end because they had cut the cold's head. Winter never ends because of one act. It ended because it always ends, because the world is not made to be only one thing. But in the north, they said when the thaw came that the queen had kept faith with them, and that mattered in ways that could not be counted. White Harbor's boats went back to fishing and to running cargo, now with stories to tell. The mountain clans went back to hunting with a certain swagger that made lowlanders roll their eyes and ask for the story anyway. Howland Reed went back to the neck and taught his children how to sew iron into hems. An old thing now new again. Arya left one morning with a bag that did not look heavy over her shoulder and a kiss on Sansa's cheek. She did not say where she was going. Sansa did not ask. She watched her sister walk away and thought of the girl who had chased cats and the one who had said the names of those she would kill to herself in the dark and the woman who had finished something the rest of them had started. She went to the Godswood again and thanked whatever she could not name for the kind of love that lets someone leave and still be yours. Sam stayed for a time and then did not because the Citadel needed him and he needed it too. He wrote letters to Sansa as if she were someone who might mark the margins with suggestions, and sometimes she did, with a wry quill and a smile. Wyman Manderley lived long enough to see grandchildren and to tell strangers that he had once watched a queen walk among the fires. When he died, the bells in White Harbor rang low and long, a sound like heavy waves on a good shore. Yon Royce trained boys who had been squires and then made them into men with a patience that others called stubbornness and he called duty. He told them, when they complained of cold in practice, that they had no idea what cold was, and then told them anyway because he could not help himself. Sansa governed. Turned out that it was something like weaving, and she had always been good at that. She learned the names of every small village on every road and had walked in enough of them that when she spoke to someone from one, she knew what the wind there sounded like. She heard petitions and she denied them when she needed to. She gave generous gifts and small ones that meant more because they came with a hand on a shoulder. She negotiated with men who wanted to count women as half and with women who wanted to count men as none. She made laws that said nothing about mercy and everything about fairness. She took counsel with people she trusted and some she did not, because she had learned that you can learn from both if you are careful. Sometimes, when the hall was quiet, she would go to the crypts and stand in front of the stone likenesses of people she had loved and had not known while loving. She would put her fingers on the cold stone of Eddard Stark's hand and say, very softly, "We kept it," and then she would go up into the bright air that was always thinner in winter and then fat with summer and do it again. Years later, a traveler from the south who had come north for a girl and found the girl and stayed said in an alehouse that the difference between the north now and the north he had been told about was simple. "They've learned to be a chain, not just a bundle," he said. "The links matter. The queen taught them." "Who taught her?" someone asked, a little drunk, a little wanting a story with an easy shape. "She learned from hunger and from halls and from a heart tree and from a brother who knew when to kneel," the traveler said and lifted his cup. "And from winter, which is the best teacher and the worst one." Jon came back one summer, thinner and marked by wind, with Ghost's muzzle silvering and Tormund's laugh roughened by years. He walked through the gates of Winterfell like a man who knows a house by the sound of its hinges. Sansa met him half the yard away, both of them walking faster as soon as they realized the other was doing the same. "You're late," she said when she could speak. "The snow was deep in the pass," he said with a smile that made him look younger and older at once. They went to the Godswood together without needing to say it. The air there was a little warmer than it had been that winter. The red leaves moved more in the breeze. The face in the bark watched them without judgment. It had seen too much for that long ago. "Do you think they forgot?" Jon asked, looking up. "Who?" "The old ones," he said, and gestured at the carved eyes and the overhead branches and whatever lay in the white beyond sight. "They don't forget," Sansa said. "They remember when we can't and forgive when we don't deserve it. That's the point of them." She took his hand because she could and because he was there and because some gestures fire cannot melt. "And we remember too," she said. "We remember that we are not alone in it, even when we are." "When it comes again," Jon said almost to himself. "When it comes again," Sansa echoed and squeezed his fingers. "They'll have stories about what to do. They'll have a queen's laws to hold them and a line of fires to light and a net in a place of honor to remind them to use what they have." Jon laughed then, and it was a happy sound, softer than war and bright in the leaves. "A net," he said. "Sam will be pleased." They stood there a long time. The Godswood listened as it always had. Past and present walked around them, not asking to be let in, already present. In the distance, someone began to sing. It was not a hymn and not a war song. It was just a song people sing when there is work to be done and there are hands to do it. Snow fell that winter too, of course. Snow will keep falling. But people in the north, from White Harbor to the last river, from Deep Wood to the Dreadfort's old shadows, looked up at it with faces that knew both sorrow and stubbornness and said, very calmly, "We know you." They lit small fires in their yards at night and larger ones when needed, and they threw nets at the dark when it tried to put its hands where it was not wanted. And they told their children that someone had once cut winter in half under a heart tree, and that it was their job to cut it again if they had to. And in the great hall, when the days were long and the meat ran, people sometimes stood and shouted a name. It was not the name of a man with a title he did not want. It was the name of a woman who had sat at a table with a map and stacked bread on plates and sealed letters with a hand that did not shake and stood in a circle of salt and said the names of the dead. They shouted it because they loved her, but also because shouting it made them feel like they were part of something that would last longer than anyone's life. They shouted, and the rafters remembered the sound from the night a woman had been made queen. She had not let it change her into something foolish. She had made it into a wind that pushed everyone along. When it snowed hardest and the wind howled in the chimneys, she would sit sometimes and hoe. A cup of something warm and think, not of that night in the God's wood or of the moment the net fell, but of the morning after, when the field had been quiet and the sun had made the snow knife bright and her brother had stood with a sword that had cut a season. She would think of how ordinary his face had looked in the light. She loved him most then, in memory, for being ordinary at the edge of something extraordinary. The North kept its promise. It had made so many bad ones in the end, over long years, without meaning to. This one it kept with a ferocity that frightened even those who had made it. They rebuilt. They argued over fence lines and over who had the right to walk first in a parade. They married to cement alliances, and sometimes because they wanted to and sometimes both. They put dragonglass beads in windowsills because they liked the way the light caught them, even though part of them still shivered at the feel of it. They told stories of a great council where a man had knelt and a woman had been crowned and a line of fires had lit a frozen sky. They told them to children who grew up hearing them, and then to grandchildren who would learn to read the world against the grain when it was necessary. Some years, the beacons were lit for other reasons. A bandit raid that wouldn't break without more men. A storm-tossed ship that needed rescuing out of a frozen inlet. People still climbed and ran. They still shouted. They still answered. Because they had done it before when death itself had walked, everything after felt easier to the muscles, if not to the heart. Arya came and went as if she were a season. When she came, she sat with Sansa and said little and listened more, and then told a story at the end that had blood at its root and humor in its branches. She hugged Bran with a tenderness that made his face soften as if he had become a younger boy, and then she visited the weirwood alone and spoke to it in a voice only it could hear. When she went, Sansa kissed her forehead and did not ask when she would be back, because that was never what sisters had been meant for. One winter night, when the moon was sharp and high and the snow squeaked under boots like new chalk, Jon stood on the wall that was not a wall anymore and looked out over the dark. Tormund came to stand beside him without preamble and held out a skin. Jon drank and coughed and handed it back. "We did it once," Tormund said. "If they come again, we'll do it again. We always do things twice in the north, so we remember how." Jon smiled at that and thought of a girl with a knife like a sliver of night, and a woman with a crown she took off when she wished, and a boy who had eyes for the past and the future, and a tree that watched over them because someone had asked it to. He thought of a smuggler with a net, and a bookish man with a pen, and a smith with hands burnt and stubborn, and a small lady with a voice like a horn, and an old lord who had learned to be simple in the end, and a reed man who had known exactly how to place his feet since he was a child. He thought of a council called when the snow was falling hard and the nights were getting longer, of a kneeling that hadn't diminished him and a coronation that had steadied a people. He thought of how right it had felt to put a sword into someone else's hands and swear to be that sword. The wind cut his cheek the way an old friend will slap your back too hard and then ask if you're eating. He closed his eyes and let it sit there a moment. Then he turned and went down into warmth, because there was work yet and there always would be, and winter would come and winter would go. And in between, there would be bread and sweat and small jokes over big work and fires that should be tended. He slept that night and dreamed not of ice breaking or of nets or of faces falling into shards, but of a hall where people were being noisy and happy, where a woman smiled and rolled her eyes at them and then smiled again, and where the rafters held up the roof as if they had always belonged and always would. He woke with that taste in his mouth, the taste of wood and cooking and a kind of peace that is not a gift but a craft. And he rose and dressed and went into the day.